I thought I was just cleaning the shed, until he followed me in, and everything changed. The afternoon sun hung low over the backyard, spilling warm gold across the grass and the edges of the wooden shed. I was carrying a stack of empty plant pots, my arms straining slightly under the weight, when I noticed her standing just beyond the garden gate. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. Somehow, even at a distance, she had a presence that made the air feel heavier, sweeter, somehow different. I paused, letting the pots rest against my hip, and watched. She was arranging flowers along the edge of the stone path, her hands delicate but sure, moving with a grace that felt effortless. The way her hair caught the sunlight, soft waves of chestnut with streaks of gray that somehow made her seem more alive, made me forget the chores waiting in the shed. She glanced up briefly, and for a second our eyes met. It wasn't the kind of glance that shouted or demanded attention. It was quiet, measured, like she had noticed me but didn't need to speak. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't expected, a warm flutter I could neither ignore nor fully understand. Shaking off the sudden heat rising to my face, I remembered the task I had come for, the shed. Its wooden door leaned slightly ajar, the scent of sawdust and oil wafting through the gap. I stepped toward it, hoping to retreat into the comfort of my work, but the moment I took another step, I heard her soft laugh, low, almost musical, floating on the breeze behind me. Without thinking, I turned, and there she was, walking toward the shed, her movements unhurried, but precise. The way her dress swayed around her knees, catching on the corners of the sunlit stones, made it impossible for me to look away. I followed instinctively, as if pulled by some unspoken gravity, until we were both standing inside the shed, the wooden walls enclosing us in a space that felt impossibly intimate. Inside, the air smelled richer, wood, earth, a faint hint of her perfume. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight streaming through the small window, and every sound, her breathing, the shift of her weight, the soft thud of my own footsteps, felt amplified. I was acutely aware of the closeness, how her shoulder almost brushed mine as we both reached for the same box of tools. Our hands met briefly, just fingertips, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't explain. She looked at me then, those quiet, confident eyes softened by something tender, something hesitant. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but the words felt heavy on my tongue. Instead, I simply nodded, offering a small smile, and she smiled back. A subtle acknowledgement, almost imperceptible, but it made the air between us feel charged. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just about helping with a chore. There was something in her presence, something that made my pulse quicken and my thoughts stumble. The shed, the sunlight, the dust, the simple brush of her hand. It all seemed to whisper that this ordinary afternoon was about to become anything but ordinary. And as I watched her lean down to pick up another pot, I knew I would follow her, silently, wherever this quiet pull might lead. The shed felt smaller the closer we stood, walls lined with stacked boxes, old tools, and sunlight filtering through the narrow window. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the wooden floor under my boots, the soft rustle of her dress as she bent to pick up a crate. I tried to focus on the task, convincing myself that organizing the clutter was the priority, but the moment our hands brushed while reaching for the same box, a jolt ran through me that made me pause mid-motion. She laughed softly, a sound that felt warm and disarming. "Careful," she said, her voice low but teasing, and there was something in the way she said it, a hint of awareness, a spark of mischief, that made my chest tighten. I nodded, trying to hide my racing heart, and let her take the lead for a moment, watching the way her fingers curled around the handle with a combination of strength and grace. The air in the shed was thick with dust and sunlight, but somehow her presence made it feel intimate, almost electric. I noticed small details I wouldn't have otherwise, the faint perfume lingering around her, the way her hair caught the light, the subtle tilt of her head when she concentrated on sorting the tools. I felt foolish for noticing, but I couldn't help it. Every movement of hers seemed to pull my attention in, demanding it in a way that words never could. We worked side by side, sometimes reaching for the same items, sometimes handing each other tools without thinking. Each touch, however brief, lingered in my memory. The brush of her fingertips as she passed me a hammer, the warmth of her hand as it rested momentarily near mine on a crate. I became aware of how close we were standing, the narrow space forcing proximity I might not have chosen otherwise. But now, I couldn't imagine stepping back. At one point, she paused, straightening and looking at me with a small, amused smile. "You're taking this very seriously," she said, and there was a softness in her tone that made me aware of her eyes lingering on mine a second too long. I laughed nervously, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, and for a moment, the world outside the shed seemed to vanish. The sun, the yard, even the sound of birds, all eclipsed by the subtle tension between us. Then she shifted closer to reach a box on the top shelf, and I instinctively stepped forward, offering support. Our hands met again, this time more intentionally, lingering slightly before she withdrew hers with a soft sigh. I wanted to say something, to acknowledge it, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I let the silence stretch, letting the charged energy speak for us. It was in that quiet, in that small, sunlit shed with dust motes drifting lazily through the air, that I realized the ordinary had already begun to feel extraordinary. The simple act of sorting crates and tools had become a dance of glances, touches, and unspoken questions. And I knew, with a certainty that startled me, that I was no longer just helping her organize the shed. I was drawn to her in a way I couldn't fully explain, and every brush of our hands, every shared smile, only pulled me deeper. By the time we set the last box in place, I was acutely aware of the closeness, the rhythm we had fallen into, and the quiet, magnetic tension between us. This shed, this ordinary, cluttered, dusty space, had somehow become a threshold, a private world where something unspoken was starting to grow, and I had no intention of turning away. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the wooden floor of the shed, and the air felt warmer somehow, thick with dust and sunlight. We had been working in a quiet rhythm for a while, moving boxes, stacking tools, and occasionally brushing against each other. It was easy, almost effortless, yet beneath the surface, I felt a tension that hadn't been there before. A tension that wasn't just about proximity. She paused suddenly, crouching down beside a small wooden crate, and I noticed the slight tremor in her hands. For a moment, she didn't speak, simply looking at the worn wood as if it held some secret. I leaned closer, instinctively concerned. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual, hesitant, almost fragile. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something different in her eyes. Not the quiet confidence that usually radiated from her, but something softer, more exposed. "It's nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was a hesitation, a pause that made it clear it wasn't nothing at all. I could see the weight she carried, the subtle lines of worry around her eyes, and I realized that this moment, this pause, was a rare glimpse behind her composed exterior. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand gently on her arm. The warmth of her skin against mine sent an unexpected shiver through me, and I felt her body tense slightly before relaxing under my touch. "You can tell me," I said softly. "I'm here." She took a slow breath, glancing away toward the small window where sunlight fell in golden stripes across the floorboards. "It's just, sometimes it feels like everything is too much. Responsibilities, expectations. Life, I suppose," she admitted, and there was a vulnerability in her tone that made my chest ache. It wasn't a confession of love, it wasn't even a plea, but it was an invitation to connect, to witness her in a way few people ever did. I nodded, feeling the intensity of the moment. I didn't speak. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. Instead, I offered quiet presence, the simple act of keeping my hand near hers, the small awareness that she wasn't alone. She shifted slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, a soft, floral note that seemed to linger in the warm, dusty air. For a long moment we stayed like that, close, aware, suspended between tasks and unspoken feelings. The shed felt like a different world, a private space carved out for honesty, however fragile. Every subtle gesture, the tilt of her head, the soft sigh as she exhaled, the way our shoulders nearly touched, carried weight, meaning. And though nothing overt happened, the silence was heavy with something unspoken. A recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of connection, of mutual understanding, of something budding that neither of us could yet name. By the time she straightened, brushing her hands on her pants, I felt a shift. The task of the shed was still there, waiting, but the unspoken intimacy had changed everything. I realized, as I handed her the next crate, that the moment of vulnerability had done more to pull us together than any shared laughter or accidental touch ever could. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. By the time we had cleared the last of the smaller crates, the shed felt strangely different. No longer just a dusty, sunlit workspace, but a confined world charged with something delicate, something electric. Every movement, every glance, seemed to carry weight, though neither of us spoke about it. We were lifting a larger box together, standing side by side. Her hand brushed mine briefly as we adjusted our grip, a fleeting touch that lingered in memory longer than it should. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the thin fabric of my gloves, the subtle pressure of her body moving in rhythm with mine. Our eyes met for a split second, and the quiet pause that followed said more than words ever could. There was an unspoken awareness between us, a tension that neither tried to name. It was in the way she tilted her head slightly when she concentrated, the way her lips pressed together in thought, the faint exhale she let out when our hands met accidentally. I became hyper-aware of every detail, the soft scent of her hair brushing against my arm, the warmth radiating from her shoulder when we leaned close to maneuver a box, the low hum of her presence that seemed to echo in the wooden walls. She laughed softly at one point, brushing a speck of dust from her hand, and I noticed the way her eyes lingered on mine, almost searching, almost daring me to acknowledge what we both felt. My pulse quickened, though I tried to steady it, focusing instead on the task at hand. And yet, every intentional or accidental touch made the world narrow, as if the shed itself had shrunk to accommodate only the two of us. The quiet hum of tension wasn't just about touch. It was about proximity, the unspoken awareness of closeness that left our hearts fluttering. When we both reached for the same tool, our hands met again, fingers grazing deliberately this time, and I felt a subtle shiver ripple through me. She noticed it too. I was sure of it, the faint upward curve of her lips betraying her own awareness. There was a strange comfort in it, though, an intimacy born of shared silence, of small touches that said everything without saying a word. I wanted to speak, to bridge the distance with something more tangible than gesture. But the moment felt too fragile, too charged to risk breaking with awkward words. Instead, I let the silence stretch, letting the tension speak for itself, letting the slow burn of desire simmer quietly beneath each glance, each movement, each gentle brush of skin against skin. When she finally stepped back to adjust the last shelf, I noticed how even a small distance between us seemed too far, how the air felt emptier without her near. My eyes followed her, catching the subtle sway of her hair and the curve of her shoulders, and I felt that ache, the ache of unspoken attraction, of something simmering just beneath the surface. It was in that suspended, wordless moment that I realized how easily the ordinary could become extraordinary. The shed wasn't just a place to organize tools. It had become a crucible for tension, a private world where connection, desire, and quiet affection could grow in ways neither of us could yet name. And I knew, deep down, that the unspoken pull between us would only grow stronger from here. By now, the shed had transformed completely in my mind. What started as a simple workspace had become a private world, a small universe where every glance, every movement, every subtle brush of skin mattered. The dust in the sunlight, the scattered tools, the warmth of the wooden walls. It all seemed charged, alive with the quiet tension that had been building between us for hours. We were moving a heavier crate together when it happened. She stumbled slightly, her foot catching on the edge of the worn floorboards, and without thinking, I reached for her. My hands found her arms instinctively, steadying her, and for a heartbeat, The world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. I could feel the warmth radiating from her body, the subtle press of her weight against mine, and the sudden rapid thump of my own heartbeat. Her eyes met mine, wide and unguarded, and in that instant, the silence spoke volumes. No words were needed. Her slight tremor, the faint sigh she let escape, the way her lips parted in surprise, all carried a depth of vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I realized, almost painfully, that she trusted me in that fleeting moment, trusted me to hold her, to steady her without judgment, without expectation. I started, but the words failed me. How could I possibly explain the jumble of emotions, the admiration, the longing, the quiet awe I felt, without sounding ridiculous or intrusive? Instead, I let my hand linger briefly on her arm, the warmth and pressure meant to convey more than speech could. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned subtly into the support, the smallest acknowledgement that she, too, felt the connection simmering between us. She drew a slow breath, almost as if gathering courage, and whispered, "It's nice having someone here, someone who notices everything." Her voice was soft, vulnerable, yet layered with something deeper, a subtle, unspoken longing that mirrored the stirrings in my own chest. The way her gaze held mine, the faint tremor in her fingers, the tiny intake of breath as she leaned slightly closer, all made my pulse race. In that quiet, sunlit shed, with dust motes floating lazily in the golden light, it hit me. The attraction, the tension, the unspoken feelings that had been building for days were no longer confined to glances and accidental touches. They existed here, now, between us, in a moment of pure, unguarded honesty. I didn't need to speak the words. Our bodies, our proximity, our shared breathing said everything. When she finally stepped back, adjusting her posture as if to reclaim some composure, I felt a pang of longing. The crate we were moving now seemed secondary to the ache of wanting to stay close, to linger in the warmth of this moment just a little longer. But even as the moment passed, something had shifted irrevocably. The quiet confession, her subtle acknowledgement, my unspoken response, had changed the dynamic entirely. We continued working, but the energy in the shed had shifted. Each movement, each glance, each almost touch now carried the weight of what had just happened. The tension had reached its peak, and neither of us needed to name it aloud for it to exist. It was real, it was charged, and I knew, with a certainty that left me both nervous and exhilarated, that our connection would only deepen from here. The shed felt lighter now, somehow less like a cramped, dusty workspace and more like a private sanctuary. The tension that had been building between us didn't vanish. It softened, becoming a gentle warmth that hummed beneath every movement. We were finished with the last of the boxes, the clutter cleared, and sunlight spilled fully through the small window, illuminating the simple order we had created together. She brushed a bit of dust off her hands, her fingers grazing the fabric of her dress in a way that made me notice the elegance of her movements again. I caught myself smiling, quietly, just observing her, aware that every small gesture, every tilt of her head, every subtle shift of her weight, seemed amplified now, filled with meaning. "Thanks," she said softly, "not just for my help with the shed, but for the moments we had shared, moments of laughter, of quiet understanding, of a connection neither of us could fully name yet." Her voice carried warmth, a subtle vulnerability that made my chest ache in the most unexpected way. I stepped closer as she reached for the last tool, instinctively brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. My fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume in the warm air. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at me with that soft, measured gaze that had always seemed to see more than she let on. That gaze, quiet and knowing, made me aware of the intimacy we had created in that small sunlit shed. For a moment we simply stood there, side by side, the golden light falling across both of us. The warmth of proximity, the subtle brush of our arms as we adjusted our positions, the shared breath in the quiet space, all of it made the world feel both impossibly vast and beautifully small. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Instead, I let my presence speak for me, offering quiet reassurance, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had formed. She smiled then, small and genuine, a smile that didn't need explanation. I felt it in my chest, a subtle shift that made everything else fade. The dust, the sunlight, even the ordinary work we had done together. What remained was the quiet, unspoken bond, the lingering energy of attraction tempered by respect and emotional depth. As we stepped out of the shed, the warm afternoon sun wrapping around us, I noticed the way her hand brushed against mine. Deliberate, yet soft. She adjusted her dress with one hand, and I caught the faint shimmer of sunlight in her hair, a subtle reminder of the grace she carried so naturally. I wanted to linger, to stretch this moment, but the day pressed on, pulling us back toward reality. And yet, even as we walked back into the open yard, something had shifted irrevocably. The shed had been just a shed once, but now it was a marker of something more. A connection, fragile and tentative, yes, but undeniably real. The tension hadn't disappeared. It had softened into a warmth that would linger long after the boxes were stacked and the tools put away. We parted with a quiet understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that something had begun. A connection that didn't need words to exist, a closeness that had deepened without forcing itself. And as I watched her move through the sunlit yard, I knew that the slow burn between us had only just begun, and that every glance, every touch, every shared silence would continue to draw us together in ways neither of us could yet predict. By the time we stepped fully out of the shed, the sunlight had softened into late afternoon warmth, casting long, golden shadows across the yard. Everything felt quieter, slower, as if the world itself had paused to let us linger in the aftermath of the moments we had shared. The shed, dusty and cluttered before, now existed in my memory as a private world, a cocoon where connection, tension, and unspoken feelings had intertwined and settled gently. She adjusted the strap of her bag and turned to look at me, that subtle, quiet gaze I had grown so attuned to over the past hour. It wasn't a look of flirtation or playfulness. Exactly. It was something deeper, something measured and knowing. I felt my chest tighten, my pulse echoing the same rhythm as the one I imagined in her own heartbeat. There was a shared understanding in that glance, a silent acknowledgement that what had passed between us was significant, even if we hadn't named it aloud. "I had a good time," she said softly, almost hesitantly, as if testing the waters of her own feelings. The simplicity of the words, the calm sincerity behind them, made my chest ache with warmth. "Thanks for helping," she added, but it felt like more than gratitude. It felt like the start of something, an unspoken promise that the connection we had begun to forge in that small, sunlit shed was not fleeting. I nodded, letting a small smile slip onto my face. "I had a good time too," I admitted, my voice low but steady, careful not to overstate or overstep. It meant more than I expected. The words weren't grandiose declarations. They were honest, quiet, and entirely human, like the relationship itself. We lingered for a moment longer, neither rushing to break the quiet, both aware that this was a delicate balance. The warmth of proximity was comforting, yet there was a gentle restraint that spoke volumes about respect and understanding. I noticed the faint brush of her fingers against mine as she adjusted her bag, a lingering touch that left a spark behind, a reminder that the unspoken tension and attraction hadn't dissipated. Then, slowly, naturally, we began to part ways. She walked toward the path leading back to her routine, and I followed at a casual pace, careful not to close the distance too quickly. Yet, even in separation, the connection lingered, the memory of her presence, the warmth of her hand brushing mine, the subtle sway of her hair in the sunlight. It was a slow-burn intimacy that didn't need dramatic gestures to exist. It was quiet, meaningful, and enduring. As I paused to watch her walk away, I realized that what had happened in the shed had changed me, even if the world outside remained the same. The moments of closeness, the subtle touches, the shared silences, they had woven themselves into my memory, leaving an imprint that would remain long after the day ended. For now, There was no need for declarations, no rush for commitment. What mattered was the connection, the understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement that we had shared something rare and meaningful. And as the sun dipped lower, casting a final golden glow across the yard, I knew with certainty that the slow burn between us was far from over, and that whatever came next, this moment would always remain a touchstone of warmth, closeness, and subtle, unforgettable longing. If you felt the tension, the quiet connection, or the slow burn romance in today's story, make sure to hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's more stories of unexpected moments, forbidden attraction, and heartwarming connections just like this one coming your way. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in his shoes?